right, can everybody see the first screen of the PowerPoint? Hopefully you can do that. I'm just going to get started. So I'm Deb Goggin. I'm the University Scientific Writer. I'm with the Department of Research Support. We help support research at the university. I'm a certified editor in the life sciences, and my primary goal or position here is to improve our publication, our peer-reviewed journal publication. So that's what I do. And we're going to talk about how to develop manuscripts for submissions to journals today. So let's just start with a basic overview of required content of a scientific journal article. And that is typically known as MRAD, which is Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion, thus the MRAD. So when drafting a journal article, you don't necessarily write in this exact order: introduction, methods, results, discussion. Generally, you're going to start with your methods because, well, you're conducting your study, and so that detail is really fresh, and then you analyze those results, and then you write your, or you analyze your results, so then the results come in, and then you start to write the discussion. What does this mean? And then you finally go back to the introduction and all of that. So it's rarely written in the exact MRAD order. And also you need to be aware that sometimes specific journals will ask you to include a separate conclusion section as part of this, instead of the conclusion being included in the discussion. All right, so where do you start when you sit down to write a journal article for a peer-reviewed journal? Well, think about structuring your document like an hourglass. So what exactly does that mean? Well, you think of the introduction as a funnel, because you're going to provide a general statement about the research area of your study to give your readers context before you start getting more specific about your study. And so typically your introduction will end with a statement about the study objective or the study purpose. So then your methods and results are going to be in the neck of that hourglass. That's because you're presenting very specific, narrow, focused information about your study only. So it needs to be very, very focused. And then your discussion is going to be like a cone, because you're going to start with the very specific information about the results that you got from your study, but then it needs to flow out to how those results apply to overall research and practice. And so that's your basic hourglass structure for constructing your document. So let's look at the structure just a little bit more closely, section by section. And we're going to start obviously with the introduction. So the first paragraph of an introduction generally introduces your research area to provide readers with context, so they know where, how you're going to, what you're going to talk about, your study. So you want a basic overview, very basic overview of the research area and just a general scope of the problem. So then your second paragraph generally discusses very briefly existing studies that relate to your study. So you may talk about, what they found, what are some of the limitations of those studies. This paragraph of the introduction kind of starts to narrow the focus more towards your study. And your goal in this area is to lead your readers into your study, to lay the foundation of why your study is necessary, because other studies don't provide enough information about this problem. So then the third paragraph of the introduction ties all that summary groundwork together. Sometimes this is the place where you might start the paragraph with pointing out the limitations of previous studies, and that shows why your study is necessary. The introduction basically should end with the stated purpose of your study, and it also might include a hypothesis statement, and that depends on the journal. Some journals specifically say you have to have a hypothesis statement at the end of your introduction, and some of them don't. It doesn't matter. So in general, the introduction is going to be about 3 paragraphs or a page of text. Can be a little longer, that's fine. But you don't want to waste too many of your words in the introduction. You just want to lay that foundation, provide context and background so that then they can understand the rest of your study better. So then the next section is going to be the methods. And so the purpose of the methods is to inform the reader about what you did. And the reader needs to have enough detail so that they can evaluate the scientific merit of your study. And if they want, they need to have enough detail to exactly repeat your study. That's science should be reproducible. And so others can verify your findings, or they can refute your finding and say, that's not what we found. We need to investigate further. The methods is also the place where you need to define all your variables, all the outcomes you expect. This is also a place to establish specific wording for your variables and your outcomes, and the specific order of those variables and outcomes in the document. We'll talk more about the specificity of the order and the variable and the wording, but that's a very important point. And the methods is also the section of the document where you are required to report information about institutional review board approval. If you're doing an animal study, you need to have your animal care committee oversight. That has to be in the methods sections. If you're doing a study of human participants, you also need to make sure you mention informed consent in this section. You know, if you had IRB exemption, you still have to mention that in this section. Those all need to be in the methods. So after the methods, you have the results where you clearly report your study findings. Make sure to be using your previous established wording from the methods for your variables and outcomes. This consistency of the wording allows readers to group the content between sections, and it makes things clearer for them so they can understand better exactly what you did. So your results is obviously, it's a very data focus, and in a journal article, you want to use a combination of texts and tables and figures to present your results. For human participants research, this section is generally going to start with a summary paragraph of the population. And you do that so that readers can evaluate the merit of the subsequent results that they're reading. And you want to do that because, a study with 20 participants, the merit of that study is going to be very different than a study with, say, 200 participants. And so you want that information right up front so that they can evaluate subsequent results. Now, most journals will explicitly state that you should not report exactly data from a table or figure in the text. So the text of your results section is really supposed to be like a high-level snapshot of the really important findings of your study that you want your readers to notice. So you want them to notice it more than other ones, and so that's why it needs to be included in the text of the results. You don't want to overwhelm them with all of your results or all your data, and so just highlighting what's really important to your study in the text will just improve overall understanding of those results. So next you have your discussion section, and this is where you bring it all together and place your study findings within the context of existing literature. So journal articles are a scientific conversation, and that's what science is all about, is conversing with other scientists about research. So the discussion is where you really get to engage your readers in that conversation about your science and your research. So generally, the first paragraph of the discussion section should remind readers of your study purpose and briefly summarize the main findings of your study. You want to remind them of the study purpose here because it's been a while, since they read at the end of the introduction what your study purpose was. So if you remind them at the beginning of the discussion and then you summarize those main findings, you can show how your results are supporting that purpose. So once you've provided that grounding context, that's where you begin orienting your findings within the existing literature. And you can do that by comparing and contrasting your findings with other studies. How do your results support other studies? How do they contradict other studies? What other things make your study novel or just add to that conversation? And then every discussion section should include a paragraph about study limitations. And I want to really stress this because sometimes this paragraph gets omitted, but it's really important. Don't ignore it. Acknowledging your study limitations adds to the scientific rigor of your study, and readers are more likely to consider your findings more favorably because you've owned up to your limitations. You don't want to oversell your study in here because there's always going to be limitations in research. So this paragraph, the limitations paragraph, usually, and sometimes journal instructions ask for this, usually will naturally lead into another paragraph about future studies and future research. What studies are necessary to address your limitations? Or maybe your research results have raised more questions that you need more studies to address and answer those questions. For example, generally, if you had a study of human participants, maybe you can't really generalize your findings because your participants were too similar, and so they can't be generalized to a wider population. So finally, in the discussion, you want to make sure that section conveys what your results mean. You can indicate what they mean for future practice, future research. Think about why your study is important, why the readers should care, and what they can do with your results. And you want to, as you're constructing your discussion, kind of try and really make sure that it addresses those areas. So though, and like I said before, even though a conclusion section is not typically part of the MRAD format, a lot of journals actually do ask for a separate conclusion section in a journal article. So we're going to talk about that. So think of your conclusion section, it should be a paragraph, as a study blurb. So like the blurb on the back of a book that you read, you want your conclusion to succinctly tell readers what your study was about. So you want to provide those high-level summary, the high-level summary of your main findings, and you want to really think about what you want readers to take away from your study and make sure that the takeaway is very clearly expressed in the conclusion. Just as a little aside, generally you're not going to have any references in the conclusion section. It's focused mainly on your study. And finally, you really want to make the conclusion kind of memorable, because honestly, a lot of times the conclusion is the first, sometimes the only section of your journal article that a reader will actually read. A lot of times people start with the abstract and they read the conclusion, and then they decide if they want to go back and read more of the article. So you really want to make this section memorable to make the readers want to find out more about your study. So next we're going to go to the abstract. So that's a main section of the a journal article that is required. It comes at the beginning of the article, but we're talking about it last because it's easier to write after you have a first draft of the document. And your abstract is a mini version, another kind of snapshot of your study. So once you have the whole overall content of what you did and you've kind of got the wording for that, it's much easier to figure out what's really important to put in the limited word limit of your abstract. So you have to be really selective. And because of the purpose of an abstract, really, to just convey what you did, it's going to be really heavy on your methods and results. And because of word limits of abstracts, usually it's about 300 words, you can really only emphasize, what the main findings are. And so how you do that is you want to provide just enough methods in your abstracts to make the results understandable for the readers. So, and when you're reporting your results in the abstracts, and this I want to really emphasize because I see this a lot, when you're reporting your results, make sure that you're supporting your statements with actual numerical data. It's not enough in an abstract to say that your intervention improved outcomes. Readers actually need to have numerical data to evaluate the validity of that statement. And now you can't, again, because of word limits, you can't necessarily provide a bunch of data, but just enough so that they can evaluate that. So we're going to get a little bit more specific about abstracts because there's two different types of abstracts for journal articles. You have your structured abstract and your unstructured abstract. Mostly an unstructured abstract is you just write it as a paragraph. And typically unstructured abstracts are much shorter, like a 150 to 200 word limit. So you're very, very limited in those. For the structured abstracts, this is all of the main headings that they require according to American Medical Association or the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. Those are the kinds of headings that they want in here, but typically your journal is only going to want you to provide a context, objective, methods, results, and conclusion headings for your abstract. So they just lump all of the design, setting, patient, all that into methods. And so it's important to know, though, when you are writing a structured abstract and you're required to use all of these headings, because you have a very limited number of words, sentence fragments are perfectly acceptable to use in a structured abstract to meet requirements. So that's something to remember as you're writing that. So these are the two different kinds of abstracts, pretty straightforward. So now that we have kind of a basic understanding of maybe the required parts of the journal article, the next step in your manuscript development is to kind of start thinking about a target journal. Once, maybe as you're constructing your draft, you have a target journal in mind. Maybe you wait until after you have your first draft to think about the target journal. But once you have a draft and you're starting to think about your target journal, the first thing you need to do is you go and read the author instructions. It's really important to read author instructions when you're submitting to journals. So it's important, you need to follow all of their instructions as closely as possible to ensure that your document has the best chance of being accepted for publication. Journals get a lot of submissions, and sometimes the easiest way to thin out journals or submitted articles is to say, well, did they follow our instructions? Well, no, they didn't follow our instructions, so we're going to automatically reject it because we don't have time or resources to fix something that they should have done in the first place. So what are some of the things that you really need to pay attention to in the author instructions? Let's start with the title page as the very first thing of your document submission. Journals almost always have very, very specific instructions about the information they want on the title page. It's, typically you're going to have your title, your author list, your affiliations, your corresponding author information. Sometimes there's other information they want on the title page, like disclosures, maybe your IRB information. So just pay attention to that information and make sure it's all there. And sometimes your journal will use a double blind review. If you guys don't know what that is, double blind means that your document is blinded, so no one can tell where the study was conducted, and the peer review people, you don't know who they are either. So with a double blind review, you don't want any identifying information on that title page because it unblinds the document. And so journal will say, don't even submit a title page. It gets submitted separately, so only the editors see it. Or maybe your title page is the title of your document only. But you need to make sure you've read the author instructions so you know which way that you need to do that. Journals also have very specific word limit requirements for everything. So like I said before, abstract always is going to have a word limit. The main text is usually going to have a word limit too. And again, you have to read the instructions because generally the word limit for your main text is the introduction section through the conclusion section or discussion, whichever one they want to do. But sometimes they include everything. They will say your word limits include the abstracts and the references and any tables, figures, or maybe it's the abstract through the references are part of the word limit. So you really need to make sure you've read the instructions and you're aware of which they mean. If they aren't specific, generally, if they say the text word limit is say 3,000 words, which is a general word limit for journal articles, they just mean the introduction through the conclusion, abstracts not included, references aren't included. You also need to be aware of mentioning references. Sometimes journals have reference limit restrictions. So for instance, if a journal limits your references in your article to 30 references and you submit a document with 50 references, again, they're going to be like, well, you didn't read instructions, so we're just automatically going to reject this. So those are things to be mindful of as you're reading your journal instructions. So what are some of the other things that you have to be aware of? So first, you're going to have the general formatting of your article. And typically, journals are very specific about the typeface of the text, the font size, the line spacing. Generally, journals want, Times New Roman at 12 point and double spacing. As we said, they have the specific formatting of the abstract. They may have specific instructions for your keywords. Most journals do use the structured abstract format, and sometimes they're very specific about their headings. Sometimes those headings are a little non-standard. For instance, maybe they'll use background instead of context and objective. So you have to just read their instructions and just be aware of what they want. We mentioned disclosure information a little earlier. So they're going to always ask for financial disclosures, conflicts of interest, and they usually have specific ways they want that text worded. They have specific instructions about where they want it in the document. Sometimes they ask for it on the title page. Sometimes they ask for it in a section between your main text and your references. So you just have to read your instructions to know where that information has to be placed. And then, of course, you have your references. In addition to possible reference limits, you're going to have specific instructions about how they want in-text citations formatted, and then how they want the information in the reference list formatted. And that's a prime place for journals to automatically reject your document if you did not follow their reference format. So then another important thing to be aware of, most author instructions will say what specific style guide they follow in the formatting of their documents for just basic, how do we format headings? How do we do paragraph indentation? What are some of the grammatical conventions we like to follow? So with the medical science and health sciences journals are mostly going to be following two styles, your American Medical Association, AMA, or the American Psychological Association, APA. Sometimes journals will state that they follow the ICMJE style, which is, again, like I said, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. If a journal says they follow that format, then that means that they follow AMA style. So one final comment about following journal instructions is, don't think that following the instructions to the letter is unnecessary because the journal will change things later. I do know that this sometimes can be what some people think, but do not expect the journal editors or your reviewers to revise your document. That is a good way to get your document rejected. You know, being able to follow instructions shows the journals that your article has scientific merit because you took the time to follow their instructions. So you probably took the time to perform your study in a really good way. Now, as much as possible, you want to strive to make your document meet all of the journal requirements and those author instructions. If it's not possible, you know, just follow them as much as possible. You know, it is very common in author instructions, unfortunately, to have contradictory instructions. And so in those instances, generally, you just kind of use your best judgment about which instructions to follow. Maybe what are they saying? Because some of the instructions sometimes could be the publisher, and sometimes the actual journal, so that there could be differences in instructions between the publisher of the journal and then the actual journal. And sometimes I tend to, in that case, maybe what do they actually do in current published articles? Maybe kind of tailor the document to what the current published articles are doing. So one of the best resources I have encountered, I have been doing this for quite a while, is this journal article from the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine, How to Write Your First Research Paper. It's mostly designed for novice researchers, students, but there are some really good suggestions in this article for writing each section of the document, kind of what should be in this section, how, you know, how can you get that information in there? It has really good time management strategies for getting documents written, which I know can be difficult for people who are pressed for time. And so, of course, the final thing with this, when you're writing a document, you know, you have to actually take time to write them. I know it can be challenging when you have multiple commitments to kind of work on writing a document for a journal article, but, you know, so do what works for you to get things done. Maybe you have to write in small manageable chunks. Maybe you have to like schedule a big block of an appointment and keep that appointment. You know, whatever you do, keep writing appointments with yourself so you can keep that process going forward, because something is better than nothing. And at this point, I am open for any questions about this section. If anyone just wants to speak before I move on to the next part of this presentation, please do so. And if there are any things in the chat. Okay, if I don't see any.
Deb, there is a question from
Yes.
Victoria. What does A stand for in IMRAD?
And. Introduction, methods, results, and discussion. It just, sometimes you'll see that as IMRD. Typically they include the A for and, because it makes it more of an acronym instead of an initialism. So you can say it like a word instead of having to say IMRD. Does that help? Anything else? All right, then we're going to move on to the next section, which is actually, what do you do once you have a draft of your document for submitting to a journal? So this is the step after you've got a draft, you've read your instructions, you've revised your document to meet those journal instructions. So you want to do one last review of your document to make it as strong as possible, because you want to make sure this gets accepted and published. So here are some things that are good to consider as you start to review, revise your document before submission. So we want to be aware of your readability of your document. You want to make sure you're answering the reader's questions when they occur, and revision, which is what you're doing, but revision more deeply. So let's look at these separately. So the most important thing to realize about readability, the first point, is that scientific documents and scientific writing are different from other types of scholarly writing. So in a scientific writing, the point of the manuscript comes before the evidence. A research manuscript is not a mystery novel. We don't want to know who done it. And I'm stressing this information about the difference between scientific writing and other types of scholarly writing, because there is a big difference, because other types of scholarly writing tend to build an argument first, and then the point comes after all the supporting evidence. And this seems obvious, but there's a really strong tendency that I have noticed for people to kind of use point last writing in scientific documents. And I'm sure everybody's read a document before where you have this extensive literature review at the beginning of the document, and the point of the study, why you did it, is really hard to find or even figure out. And so you're struggling to figure out why you're reading this. So as you review your document, you want to really kind of think about what's the message you're trying to convey. Is your point being clear? Having said this, though, saying, you put the point first, it doesn't mean that the study purpose goes at the very beginning of the introduction. It's just that you're constructing that to clearly lead to your study purposes as succinctly as possible. So now we're going to go back to that other point I talked about earlier about consistency. So consistency is a major aspect of readability. So it's really important for writing and submitting better documents. And there are kind of different types of consistency. So let's look at the first one. And that is to be using the consistent wording throughout the document for like study variables and outcomes. If you decide that you have study groups that you were comparing, and you want to capitalize group 1, group 2, group 3, make sure that it's capitalized throughout the document, because that consistency improves the readability, and so readers can understand what you've done. So let's look at examples. So when you use different wording for the same thing, for the same variable or outcome, it can lead to reader confusion. This is why we want to be consistent. So do you mean the same thing when you use different wording, or are you meaning something different? And so in this example, this super easy example, we're looking at this. There's the study population is, you use students in the abstract, participants in the introduction, and then survey respondents in the results. So this can be really confusing. Are these the same group? Are they different? Readers can't necessarily tell because the wording is inconsistent and they're not sure. So to correct this, all you would have to do is you go back through your document, is just kind of look for the consistency of wording. Well, I've not used the same wording for my variables, and so I'm going to revise through these sections to the same wording. In this case, I just chose students to just use that all the way through. And this specificity provides the readers with the detail, and it's less confusing, and they can actually focus more on what you're saying. Another example of consistency is order, which I also kind of discussed in the description of the methods section. You want to use the same order of your variables throughout the document. Using that order, same order leads to better readability, because they always know that you're going to present your results in the exact same order. So let's look at an example of that. Again, this is a very simple example, and we have demographic characteristics, and in the methods section, age and sex are placed in one variable order, but in the results, you reported in something totally different. So to just correct this, again, you would just go through as you're revising your document right before you submit it and look at this and go like, oops, those are out of order. So you revise the same order, and that's, you know, it can really improve your readability. So when you establish this variable order in your methods section, and as you go back through their document, you might also find as you're constructing this and reviewing that, you know, maybe your first established order doesn't actually serve the document as well as you want it to, that it needs maybe a slightly different order of variables to make your results more understandable or improve the readability. So, you know, as you go through and you review and you revise and you think about that, well, then maybe you do need to revise your variables, and this would be a time to do that. Maybe sometimes when you're working on your tables or your figures, you decide, you know, the table or the figure is actually going to be better, and people will be able to understand the content better with this slightly different variable order. And so if you decide to change something in a table or a figure, then you would have to go back into the document and make sure that it's revised to that better order throughout the document. And I am going to say right here, generally at this point, it's a good time to recheck your statistical analysis section when you're considering consistent wording and variable order, because that's generally where I see a breakdown of consistency in the wording and the variable order. There is one thing to be aware of also when you're considering this kind of consistency. It's if your study is a survey study, you're very limited in the wording and the order if you did a survey study, because really you're supposed to be using that wording and order from your survey in the document. So even if you decide, well, actually this would be better worded this way, you can't necessarily change it if it's a survey study because the survey used something else. So another aspect of readability is going to be parallelism. So what do I mean by parallelism? So parallelism means related items have similar wording. So think of keeping your apples with your apples and your oranges with your oranges. And there are two types of parallelism to consider as you review. So you have grammatical parallelism and parallelism of data reporting. So let's look at some examples. So grammatical parallelism mostly applies to lists of items. That's where I mostly see a breakdown of grammatical parallelism. So when you have a list of items, each item in the list has to be the same grammatically. It makes them parallel that way. So typically what I see is in this example, I see an adjective, and a verbal, which is what we have right here. It's quick, effective, and has reduced time burden. So the list isn't parallel because that last item is actually a verbal construction. So a simple way to fix that is to just revise. In this case, I have just grouped the adjectives as a compound, and then the verbal ends up just being part of a compound verb construction. And then that way you've corrected your parallelism. Now, parallelism of data reporting refers to using similar wording when you're reporting similar data. So in this second example here, tenderness and motion restriction are similar results, but they're being reported with different wording. So to make this content more parallel, you just revise so the sentences have similar wording. In this case, we can even combine the sentences into a single sentence. So this kind of parallelism of data reporting improves readability because readers typically don't have to read the entire sentence. They can focus on the results more because they know that this related data is similar. And I know sometimes when people are writing journal articles, they tend to avoid this kind of construction because they think it's a repetitive, and writing shouldn't be repetitive. But in scientific writing, you really want to be repetitive. It's okay and expected because that repetition improves clarity. It improves readability. They don't get confused when you vary the wording of your outcomes or your variables. So you really want to just kind of focus on that. Okay, a final aspect of readability we're going to talk about is subject-verb togetherness. What do I mean by that? It means whenever possible, you should try to get the sentence, subject, and verb as close together as possible. So why is that important? It's important because it allows the reader to focus on the point you're making. So the action or point of a sentence is typically conveyed in the verb. And so if you separate the sentence subject from the verb, the reader is distracted looking for the point of the sentence. Now, this is not something that consciously happens, but it does actually happen if you, in reader theory kinds of thing. Your brain starts looking for the action and you're focusing on what's going to happen, what's the action of this sentence. And so you don't even really digest the content between that subject and then when you finally hit the verb. So that putting the subject and verb together makes things more active. So let's look at an example of this. In this example, the subject and verb are separated by a such as construction that is providing the reader with details about these additional variables that should be studied in future studies. So what's the point of the additional variables? Well, the reader doesn't necessarily want to know what they are right away because they want to know why they're important, why they should be concerned about this. So to fix this is a simple example. You just put your subject and verb together. So this way the reader can immediately see why you think these additional variables are important for future studies, and then they can really focus on what other variables or outcomes you think need to be studied in those future studies. So now we're going to look at the next main area to consider when reviewing your document before submission. And this we're kind of touching on all of these a little bit, and that is answering the reader's questions. So what does that mean? It means you should provide information in your document answering the reader's questions right when a reader would want to know that information. So a good example is in your methods section, when you're describing your participant population, readers are going to probably immediately think about, okay, how did you recruit your participants? What were your inclusion and exclusion criteria? How did they provide informed consent and things like that? And so to answer the reader's questions, you're going to want to provide all that relevant information right about when a reader would be like, hey, but wait, what about this? What about that? And make sure you're answering it. Sometimes it's even helpful to explicitly acknowledge information that is irrelevant for the study to answer readers' questions. Typically, sometimes you may have to say, they're going to ask about this, but we didn't do that. So you might want to say, we intentionally didn't measure X because of Y. But you want to make sure you're using explicit wording for all this, so the readability, the consistency, so readers understand why you did this stuff. Because readers aren't in your head, you need to be very explicit. They don't know what you meant or what you intended. They only know what you wrote. So you have to be very clear about what you meant and answer their questions to improve the readability of the document, and then that will ensure the research has a wider audience and more applicability. So another aspect of answering reader questions applies to the discussion section. You want to make sure the end of each discussion point answers these questions: so what and what does it mean for current practice, future research. Be explicit. Don't make readers wonder what you mean or what your results mean. Implying what you mean is not enough in a scientific document. Sometimes you need to just use extra words to answer these questions. And finally, we're going to go to the last main area to address everyone's favorite thing, revision. Revision is the most important final step for any type of writing. It is about re-seeing the content of your document. And it's definitely more than copy editing for correct grammar and mechanics. When revising the content, consider whether the existing words convey the message you want them to. You may need to review sentence by sentence to evaluate that. This is also the time to deeply consider your science and make sure that it is correctly conveyed in the document. And you also need to accept that revision is an ongoing process, so you may have multiple drafts. And don't be discouraged by that. Each revision will make your document stronger and increase its chances of acceptance. So what do you look for when you're revising your document? One of the things is to keep it simple. What does this mean? It means using the simplest word that works. So for example, you're going to write, we used a survey design for our study instead of we utilized a survey design, or write, our patients had improved outcomes after the intervention instead of patients demonstrated improved outcomes. Another way to keep it simple is to break up long sentences into smaller ones, because important points can get lost when you have a really long sentence. So here's an example of that. By breaking up long sentences into smaller ones, you give the reader a chance to take a breath, affected by the use of the period, and digest one point before moving to another. So I'm going to read this example so you can see how hard it can be to understand the content. The study by Smith et al. Had participants verbally report tenderness and rate perceived intensity of the pain on the visual pain scale, unlike in the current study, where in addition to perceived pain intensity, we also included the use of an algometer, but neither study evaluated the inter-examiner reliability of the palpatory pressure used to assess tenderness. Get very winded with that. So two long sentences like this are often in your discussion section. So that's one area to look for something like this. So how do you correct it? Here's a solution. A study by Smith et al. Had participants verbally report tenderness and rate perceived intensity of the pain on the visual pain scale. So you make the first point its own sentence, and you allow readers a chance to digest the information about the Smith et al. Study. In the current study, we also used perceived pain intensity as an outcome, but we included the use of an algometer as well. So this one, you focus the reader's attention on your study. However, the inter-examiner reliability of the palpatory pressure used to assess tenderness was not assessed in either study. And so this last sentence brings the two studies together and explains what they mean. You bring the point into the overall scientific conversation about this research. So a simple technique to use with the discussion section is what I call a discussion check, where you put the first sentence of each paragraph into a single paragraph to check that you have a cohesive content. And that way you verify that you're conveying the intended meaning of the discussion section of that conversation. So let's look at an example of a discussion section as a paragraph. Now this is just as an example, like took the first sentence of every paragraph. And I'm just going to read this really quick so you can see what it would sound like. And then you would know what the discussion section is going to talk about. So the objective of the current study was to group related items of the PPS into common subscales. We omitted 3 items from all subscales, included 4 items in 2 subscales. Confirmatory factor analysis confirmed placement of items into these subscales. Differences in environment and student populations may influence responses to a small number of questions. Other researchers have used the PPS to measure stress in medical students. The current study had several limitations. Future studies should use the PPS to screen for items unique to specific populations of students. So this is a good example. I mean, it's pretty cohesive. So you can tell what is exactly going to be discussed in that kind of paragraph. So finally, we're going to get to the last aspect of revision, and that is applying to reducing word count. So when you're submitting your document to a journal, you always, like I said, have to be aware of word limit restrictions. So you finally get your draft, you write it, you think everything is in it, but then it's over word count. So how do you reduce word count without sacrificing the overall content? First, delete all the adverbs and adjectives. You hardly ever need to use adverbs in a document. They tend to be leading and can result in biased wording. So that's a good place to start. Adjectives are also rarely necessary. So next, you would want to delete your redundant words. So what do I mean by that? A redundant word is implied or repetitive. A common thing that I see is when people say both X and Y were assessed, both is actually a redundant word because it's implied when you use and, that if you have two variables, both of them were assessed. Sometimes your articles like a or the can be considered redundant. That's a good place to kind of see if you can cut out some of the articles and reduce word count. And finally, you want to delete the dead words. So what are dead words? Those are filler words that don't add to the overall content. Examples of dead words are the fact that, or is interesting that. And importantly though, when you're reducing word count, these are not just for reducing word count. This is just in general, when you're trying to improve the document, look at these things. Do I have extra words here that aren't really adding to it? It just removing these types of words make your document stronger. So I have an example of reducing word count. Examples from all the categories on the previous slide are adding to the 86 word paragraph here. You'll notice that I have helpfully highlighted wording that is not really necessary to the overall understanding of the point that's being made here. So as I read this, kind of be aware of those and think about that. So for practitioners of manual medicine, palpation of tissue texture, joint range of motion, and tissue tenderness are often considered important for evaluation of both symptomatic and asymptomatic patients. Some authors claim that a gold standard for palpatory accuracy is very important in order to establish the reliability of different examiners. One way to quickly assess reliability is the use of consensus training of examiners. It is interesting to note that very few published studies have reported the use of consensus training as part of their methodology. Okay, lots of dead words, adverbs, adjectives, redundant words in this. So now let's look at the reduced version. Palpation of tissue texture, joint range of motion, and tissue tenderness are important for evaluation of patients. A gold standard for palpatory accuracy may establish reliability between examiners. Consensus training can be used to assess reliability, but few studies have investigated this method. So I have removed all those words and reduced the word count from 86 to 43, while still retaining the intended meaning. An important thing about reducing word count, though, is that you need to make sure you aren't deleting important information. So really can be a fine line between removing unnecessary wording and just removing wording. So that is it for today's presentation about developing manuscripts for submissions to journals. And I am open for any questions. Anybody?
Hello, Deb. Thank you.
Hey, Quincy.
Hey. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Wish I had this years ago. This is awesome.
Yeah, well, the other Deb, attached the PowerPoint to the invitation. So if anybody wanted to look through that again, and there's a lot of information, and my purpose is to get articles in peer-reviewed journals, so you can contact me and I can help review documents for submission to journals to make sure it's in journal format and other things. That's what I do.
Is there a limit to how many we submit at one time to you for
No,
review?
no, there will just be a waiting period for the most part. So it depends. I generally, if people ask for my help, I will let you know where my reviewing queue is, where the status is, and how long it's going to take me to review through documents. I will say though, if there are things with an immediate resubmission deadline, as in you've submitted your document and they said revise, resubmit, and it has to be returned by this date, anything with a resubmission deadline goes to the front of my line. So then that means anyone behind, unfortunately, may get booted. But, you know, I just try to get everyone as much as I can. And it is 2 o'clock, so I think technically we're done. And if I don't have any other questions. Yes, Deb?
Yes, I think so. Thank you so very much, Deb. Like really, it's been great. And we sent out a survey after this. So if you have any other questions, you can tag on to that question or the survey, and I'll make sure to send all your questions back to Deb if you have any. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.